On a stormy Halloween night, a passenger plane begins a routine landing. But what happens is far from routine. Investigators must determine what terrible chain of events brought it down nose first, killing everyone aboard. In the fog, a Canadian commuter plane aborts a landing maneuver. Seconds later, it plows full speed into the woods nearby. Was the accident caused by mechanical failure or a fatal lapse of judgment? The answers are preserved in the indestructible black box, dutifully recording a plane's final maneuvers and the crew's last words. Black boxes help investigators make sense of the fields of destruction. After a crash, a black box is often the only surviving witness to terror. On the evening of October 31st, 1994, American Eagle Flight 4184 took off in the rain from Indianapolis to Chicago, less than 200 miles away. As the twin-engine turboprop approached its destination, air traffic controllers told the crew to expect delays. A fierce storm was backing up traffic outside O'Hare International Airport. The plane was put in a holding pattern over a rural section of northeast Indiana. The pilots noticed some icing and activated equipment to crack it off the wings. They depended on the autopilot to keep the plane steady and to maintain altitude. Attendants tried to reassure passengers that they would make their connections. All the other flights were delayed too. One of the busiest airports in the world was at a total standstill. In an announcement reconstructed from transcripts, the captain tried to reassure the restless passengers.
Well, folks, once again, this is the captain. I do regret to inform you that air traffic control is saying at this point another 13 minutes. We'll be sure to keep you updated. I do apologize.
The plane had been holding for more than 30 minutes. Because of the storm, some passengers had debated whether to board the flight. Now they grew increasingly anxious. Finally, the transcripts indicated that controllers cleared Flight 4184 to begin landing procedures.
Eagle Flight 184, descend and maintain 8,000.
And down to 8,000, Eagle Flight 184.
Eagle Flight 184, should be about 10 minutes until you're cleared in.
Thank you.
It was the last communication Flight 4184 would have with controllers. As the plane began its descent, something went terribly wrong. Instead of leveling off at 8,000 feet, the plane continued to descend, picking up speed. It plummeted through 7,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 5,000 feet. At 4,000 feet, it vanished from the radar screen. The aircraft plunged into a muddy soybean field in rural Indiana, shattering on impact. Fighting driving rain and freezing temperatures, rescue workers searched through the night for any sign of life from the 72 passengers and crew. Finally, they faced the truth. No one survived. When an airplane crashes in the United States, it's up to the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, to determine what went wrong. Greg Feith was the lead investigator in the case of Flight 4184.
When I go out to an accident site, I'm playing Dick Tracy. My job is to go out and find all the evidence, all the clues that tell us what happened.
The public demands answers and looks to the NTSB to provide them, fast. So agents are brought in quickly. They are often among the first to witness the devastation.
It can be very overwhelming I mean, it's an emotional thing, because when you're walking through all of this wreckage, you're seeing pictures, you're seeing teddy bears, you're seeing clothing of children and things like that. So you can't help but start to become emotionally attached. But as an investigator, in order for me to remain objective, you have to separate your emotion out of that, and you got to block it out so that you can do your job and do it effectively. And that's not always easy for us.
As the sun rose the next morning, it revealed the true horror of the accident. Impact craters marred the once peaceful farm, transforming it to a field of death. The narrow country roads of Roselawn, Indiana, bustled with truckloads of rescue equipment and the clamor of news crews. A team of forensic aviation experts from the NTSB arrived. Their job was to create order from the growing chaos, so they could focus on the difficult task of figuring out what happened.
Immediately what our investigator and the team will do is actually what we call document the four corners. We want to look for all of the wreckage. We want to make sure that both wings are there, the tail section is there, the engines are there.
But the investigation was hampered by health risks. Fuel covered everything. The site was declared a biohazard. Only those in safety gear went in and out. Rescue workers and investigators teamed up to flag evidence and remains. They worked side by side, examining every piece. As soon as possible, parts of bodies were transported to the morgue to begin the difficult identification process.
For us, the investigators, we're looking at physical evidence of the airplane, that is, the wreckage itself. For the coroner, who has to go out there and look for the bodies or the victims, they had as tough a time as we did because they didn't have whole people. They had fragments of people. And so for both of us to do our job, we had to work hand in hand, because if I found a piece of wreckage, there may have been critical evidence for the coroner in a piece of a victim. And so we worked hand in hand when we were looking at all of this wreckage so that I could help him collect whatever evidence he needed to identify the people that were on that airplane.
As bodies were identified, they were released for burial. Family members found solace in each other and in the chaplains and counselors who volunteered to help. But in the midst of family sorrow, investigators kept working. They scoured the soybean field for answers. To figure out how the plane broke up, they viewed the wreckage from above. They examined the scars in the earth created by the impact and the locations of the scattered pieces of airplane. The patterns can tell them if a piece broke off on impact or if it fell off during flight, causing the accident. What they found in the ruins of Flight 4184 was startling.
Typically, when you have an airplane that's either come straight down or made an emergency type landing, you'll find the initial impact point and then wreckage in a V-tail or fan-shaped pattern. With this particular accident site, we had a very high-speed, high angle of attack impact into the ground, so we had a main impact crater. But we found the tail section in a very oddball place in relation to the main impact crater. That led to the team to think, how did that get there? And it was evident that it was an in-flight breakup, so the tail had come off before the airplane hit the ground.
Now investigators had a possible explanation. A structural failure may have caused the tail to break off in flight. But airplane tails don't just break off. Something must have triggered the failure. More evidence needed to be examined, more data gathered. The weather that night provided the first clue. The conditions were ideal for icing. To many, the freezing rain in which the plane was flying could have been a major factor. But it seemed unlikely that icing on the wings could cause the tail to fracture. The only way to determine what really happened would be to look inside the plane's black box. A black box is actually two boxes, and they're not black, they're orange, making them easier to find. One contains a record of the plane's mechanical workings. It's called the flight data recorder. The other is the cockpit voice recorder. Basically a crash-proof tape recorder, it contains an account of everything the pilots say. It also picks up alarms, engine noise, and perhaps the horrifying sound of impact. Within hours, the boxes were whisked away to NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C. There, technicians prepared them for analysis. Sometimes black boxes provide instant answers. Other times, they only deepen the mystery. As investigators prepared the playback equipment, they also prepared themselves. They'd be the first to hear what the pilots said as they faced death head-on. After maintaining a holding pattern near O'Hare Airport, Flight 4184 was cleared to descend from 10,000 feet. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the earth, killing everyone aboard. Now, investigators would listen to the cockpit voice recorder as the plane began its fatal plunge. The crew's words during the terrifying last moments are taken from transcripts.
I knew we'd do that. I'm trying to keep it at 180. All right. Okay, just mellow out. Okay. Low. Here. Too low.
The chilling tape made it clear the pilots were completely broadsided. They didn't know they were in trouble until it was too late. But it raised more questions than it answered. Investigators were no closer to learning what happened. Their last hope lay inside the second box, the flight data recorder, or FDR. Now, all the plane's mechanical functions, or malfunctions, would be analyzed. Doug Brazee is a black box expert at NTSB. He's responsible for turning the complicated bits of data from FDRs into useful information. The data recorded by an FDR depends on the age and type of plane it's in. The one on Flight 4184 monitored about 100 mechanical functions. Brazee downloaded the information to a computer using tape decks that translate the coded data. The information appears as charts and graphs on the computer. They represent the pilot's actions and the airplane's performance in the final minutes before it plunged to Earth. The readouts were placed side by side on a timeline to see their relationships. As the data appeared, Brazee discovered the plane had experienced an abrupt, catastrophic event. To get a better understanding, he created an animated version of the plane's last moments.
It's very difficult to get a sense of time and how quickly or slowly things can unfold from looking at numbers and graphs. The animation helps us see how quickly or how slowly things develop in the accident sequence.
The animation combines all the plane's functions just before it fell into a visual model that investigators can study. It began as the plane started its descent from 10,000 feet. Without warning, the autopilot disengaged. The ailerons, flaps on the wings that control flight, suddenly flipped. The plane rolled violently to the right. The pilots grabbed the controls and struggled to level out, but the speed of the roll was too great. It yanked the controls out of their hands, and the nose dived toward Earth. As they burst through the clouds, the ground filled their windshield, rushing toward them at 400 miles per hour. Futilely, the pilots pulled back on the controls to bring up the nose. The resulting strain on the tail was too great. It snapped off just before the plane hit the ground. The animation made the sequence of events tragically clear.
The airplane was in flight. When the airplane rolled, it initially rolled to approximately 77 degrees the first time, and the nose started to pitch down. The first officer was able to recover it slightly, and as he tried to pull the nose back up, the airplane then rolled again completely through 360 degrees. The nose pitched down, and the roll continued another approximately 140 degrees until the first officer was able to get the roll stopped. But because of the very steep attitude that the airplane was in, and as he tried to pull out, he had a lot of aerodynamic force on the tail section of the airplane because he was pulling extreme. He was actually moving these flight control surfaces to their maximum. High aerodynamic loads, this part of the airplane literally came off, and the airplane then basically went over on its nose, striking the ground and then fragmenting. And as it fragmented, this part of the aircraft ended up getting slingshotted to the furthest point in the wreckage area.
It was now evident that the crash wasn't caused by the tail breaking off in flight. That left icing as the probable cause. But Brazy knew icing would normally show up on the screen as a slow, steady buildup, not a sudden cataclysm. What could have overpowered the plane so quickly and sent it careening to Earth? Knowing what makes a plane fly can provide clues to how it can fall. At Embry-Riddle University in Prescott, Arizona, wind tunnels are used to demonstrate the aerodynamics of flight. Here, the invisible forces of wind are made to glow, unveiling the basic principle of flight. The faster that air moves over a surface, the less pressure it exerts. The slower moving air underneath pushes upward, causing the surface to lift. Aerospace engineer Richard Felton demonstrates the principle with a simple experiment.
Let me demonstrate with a sheet of paper, if I might. I'm going to blow over the top of this surface of paper, so I'm not going to create anything below. There's no magic here at all, okay? And as you can see, the paper actually raises.
Wings are not flat like paper, but they work the same way. The air moves faster across the round top of the wing because it has more surface to cover. But it's critical that the top surface be smooth and that nothing on it disrupts the flow of air. If the airflow is disturbed, the object loses the pressure that lifts it. Any foreign objects on the wings can disrupt the airflow. For instance, ice can build up, then break off, leaving jagged edges. That may produce enough turbulence to bring down a plane. Flight 4184 was an ATR-72 series airplane. Roselawn investigators discovered that these planes had a history of icing problems. But the FDR showed that its de-icing system was working properly, and the readout didn't show normal icing patterns. Then, investigators learned of a weather phenomenon called supercooled drizzle drops, extra large freezing rain. A check with meteorologists told them the conditions that stormy Halloween night were right for this phenomenon to occur. Was weather the fatal factor? To find out, the manufacturer of the ATR took to the skies over the Mojave Desert in California. There, they tried to recreate the exact conditions of the storm. In an experiment called a tanker test, a modified U.S. Air Force jet produced an icing cloud 8 feet wide. An ATR, like the one at Roselawn, flew into the cloud. The freezing rain clouds were infused with yellow dye, so investigators could see the ice forming on the nose and wings. To make sure the tragedy was not repeated, test pilots flew very high for added recovery time and were prepared to eject if necessary. At first, normal freezing rain was released. The small water droplets froze the instant they hit the front of the wings, but the de-icing boots cracked the ice off. Then, a cloud of supercooled drizzle drops was released. When the drops hit the wings, they didn't freeze instantly. Instead, they spread across the wing, freezing behind and out of reach of the de-icing boots. At last, the final piece of the puzzle was put in place.
Typically, when the wing has no contamination on it, these bands or relative wind are smooth flowing over the top and the bottom of the airfoil. But with the Roselawn accident, when we had the ridge of ice, which is represented by this triangle, we have now disrupted that airflow. As the airflow then reattached or came back across the very top of the wing, it got very turbulent as it came off the trailing edge, which is represented by this area right here. That turbulence was right over the top of the ailerons. And when the turbulence created a very low pressure system, this aileron started to move from like a neutral position up to its maximum deflection of 14 degrees in a quarter of a second.
Now, investigators concluded what happened that night and why. The pilots were in the holding pattern. They were chatting. The autopilot was on. They thought everything was fine. What they didn't know was that behind the de-icing equipment, a ridge of ice was building up. As they started to descend, the ice cracked off. What remained left ragged edges on the wing, causing turbulent airflow. The turbulence created a powerful low-pressure system that acted like a vacuum. It literally sucked the ailerons up, forcing the plane into a roll. Attempts to right the plane only snapped the tail. The plane then dove into the earth. Afterward, all was silent except for the driving rain. And then, sirens. The crater in a soybean field in Roselawn, Indiana, is a scar that can never be healed. But by solving the accident, investigators had done all they could. After the investigation, the ATR's de-icing system was redesigned, extending farther back on the wing, and ATR pilots are now trained for icing conditions. The work of the NTSB and others on the Roselawn case helped to reduce the chances of a similar accident happening again. Every airplane crash is the result of a fatal mixture of conditions. The ingredients come from the plane, the weather, and the pilot himself. In Canada, investigators tried to reconstruct a commuter plane's recipe for disaster. The mountains of British Columbia are among the most breathtaking in North America. But for pilots flying through them, they can be treacherous. In 1989, 2 young pilots at Skylink Airlines were flying 5 commuters in a 19-seat turboprop from Vancouver to Terrace, just over 400 miles away. They'd made the trip dozens of times, and they were familiar with the dense morning fog that often drifts through this part of Western Canada. The morning of September 26th was the start of just another day. Shortly before Flight 70 made its final approach to the runway, a 300-foot fog bank engulfed the airport, bringing visibility to 0. The pilot expected to see the runway lights pierce the fog at any moment. Instead, he saw only gloom. As the plane swooped down for the landing, he had second thoughts and safely aborted the maneuver. But as he pulled away, treetops suddenly loomed large through the dense haze. The airplane plowed through the branches, rolled, and burst into flames. The pilots and passengers were killed on impact. Investigators from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada were assigned the horrible task of making sense of the tangled wreckage. Trees had cracked and fallen onto the fuselage. One of the wings had sheared off. The cabin was crushed. The cockpit was peeled open, exposing a snarled mass of wires, cables, and circuitry. The force had twisted and snapped off the propellers. It took days to find pieces of aircraft that hurtled into the forest. Reading the wreckage would take even longer. It's a forensic skill that requires intensive training. At Embry-Riddle University, would-be investigators gain experience by studying the remains of actual crashes reconstructed on the site. Director of Aerospace Safety, Bill Waldock, instructs his students in what to look for and how to find it.
Well, just like in a crime scene, what I want the students to be able to do is to identify all of the things about this scene that are significant, to be able to find all of the parts, to be able to understand how those parts got where they were and what they mean, and then to be able to take that and put it into the rest of the story and literally fit all the pieces of the puzzle back together and come up with a clear picture of what happened to this aircraft and why it happened.
According to Waldock, finding out what caused a crash is the first step to preventing another one.
The main purpose we do investigations is to try to figure out what happened and why it happened, and once we've done that, then we can go change things and try to improve the rest of the system. It's an expensive way to learn, but usually it's one of the most impressive ways to learn, and we can get the point across pretty well that way.
Every detail of the wrecks is painstakingly duplicated, right down to the flames. If a crash site is on fire, it's crucial to determine if the flames started in the air or on the ground. A plane that burns then crashes shows a different pattern than a plane that crashes then burns. A fire that ignites during flight generally burns hotter than a fire caused by impact because it's fanned by the rushing wind. According to Waldock, pre-impact fires leave a distinctive signature.
One of the things that we look for in considering pre-impact fire versus post-impact fire is evidence that metal was hot when it hit the ground. And right in this area of the engine compartment on the left side, you see a little bit of feathered aluminum. To get that aluminum to broom straw or feather, that metal has to be up near its melting point. And right here we see a little bit of evidence that that process has occurred. That tells us that we had a pre-impact fire in this left engine compartment.
Less than 7% of fires occur on impact. But when they do, they make the investigators' work much more difficult. When rescue crews put out the flames, the force of spraying water moves parts a considerable distance, and the fire itself can destroy valuable evidence.
Fire will tend to get rid of our physical evidence. We're looking for example, fatigue in a metal structure. If the airplane caught on fire when it hit the ground, it'll tend to erase that evidence, tend to burn it away. And fire is one of the worst things we can do.
At the crash site in Canada, fire was only the first of the many challenges investigators would face. Burn patterns showed that the fire was the result of the impact, not the cause of it. Lead investigator Roger Ayotte recalls the scene.
The aircraft had crashed some 1,500 feet away from the airport, and the actual crash site itself was not particularly large. The airplane had hit the ground at fairly high speed, and the destruction was considerable. It certainly wasn't evident when we went onto the accident site what the problem had been. When we did start examining the wreckage, we realized that the aircraft, in fact, had impacted the ground inverted because the engine positions were switched on the ground.
Ayotte and his team reasoned the fog may have played a role, but only a minor one. The pilots were too experienced, the collision too fast and furious, the devastation too complete. In the charred rubble, investigators located the flight's black boxes, still bolted to the tail. Their bright orange exteriors were camouflaged with soot. Perhaps the boxes would reveal what happened. They were flown to Transportation Safety Board headquarters in Ottawa for analysis. In the lab, black box expert Michael Poole and computer analyst Bob Hoyle were stunned by what they found. The flight data recorder should have been an electronic device that captured most of the plane's mechanical functions on magnetic tape or microchip. Instead, It was an unauthorized and antiquated model, invented in 1951. Its use had been prohibited in many countries. Rather than electronic circuitry, the box used a stylus to etch information onto a moving roll of foil.
Okay, the flight data recorder on this aircraft was an old design. It was a foil type recorder, which is a metal foil, which 5 parameters are inscribed on the foil. And of those 5, heading, which is a key parameter, was actually not functioning. So we in fact only had 4 parameters. And in contrast with today's modern aircraft, which have 500, 600 parameters per second, obviously there's a very big difference here. So we had a very limited flight data recorder. The data on that recorder is also, the resolution is very poor, and it's extremely time-consuming to extract the information off of these foil-type recorders.
In its time, the foil recorder was a technological advance because it could survive impact and fire. Now, its primitive workings threatened to cripple the investigation. To eke out some meaning from the foil scratchings, Hoyle scanned them into a computer. Perhaps modern technology would give its predecessor a helping hand. Hoyle was able to sharpen and focus the information from the coarse etchings enough to interpret them. The FDR showed that the plane flew an unwavering course into the trees at more than 200 miles per hour. But one mark indicated something strange, a sudden burst of speed just before the plane struck. The information was incomplete and contradictory. Why would a plane, in the midst of an aborted landing, suddenly plunge into the ground? Poole and his colleagues turned to the cockpit voice recorder for an explanation. They found only more contradictions. The pilot told the co-pilot they were going to abort the landing, go around and try again. On the tape, in the background, the engines roared to full power. That was consistent with a climb. But it wasn't consistent with the disturbing final exchange between the pilot and co-pilot. Transcripts indicate the co-pilot began to warn that the plane was losing altitude.
Descending. Okay. Descending.
Well, when we first listened to the voice recorder, it was quite perplexing because the crew had initiated a missed approach. They were starting to do a go-around. We could hear engine power coming up. They were asking for gear up. They were asking for flaps up. They were starting to climb out, and for some reason the airplane transitioned from a climb out to a descent and crashed very quickly. So this was quite puzzling, and that was really where we started to focus. Why was this airplane, which should have been able to fly out, shouldn't have been a big problem, transitioning from an ascent to a descent and hitting the ground?
The black boxes yielded only vague clues. They held none of the hard data Poole had come to expect from them. He relayed the bad news to fellow investigators. The gaps left by the primitive data recorder would have to be filled in manually. A team of nearly a dozen forensic aviation specialists would have to engage in hardcore, old-fashioned detective work. Fortunately, they had an arsenal of sophisticated tools to help them. The first step was to determine if the damaged engine was the cause of the crash or the result of it. For that, investigators depended on engineering services specialist John Garstang.
As part of the crash site investigation, we saw that the right engine was extensively damaged and disintegrated. In order to understand this damage, whether it occurred in flight or it occurred in the ground as a result of ground impact, we had to know how the aircraft broke up. That's where we used tree information together with the attitude that it hit the ground to determine the breakup sequence.
Garstang specializes in coaxing clues from places investigators can't go, like the tops of the trees. He mounted a stereoscopic camera on a helicopter and shot 3D photos of the damaged trees. He used these photos to determine the angle at which the plane struck the forest.
This is the crash site. The red dots are pieces of wreckage. The aircraft initially descended through the forest starting here. All the black dots are trees that have been damaged, most of which had been cut by the aircraft.
He then created a model showing the path of the plane as it plowed through the trees. It showed the plane was level as it clipped the treetops. Both engines must have been in place, keeping the plane balanced. The roll didn't occur until after it hit the trees. Garstang concluded the engines were attached on impact. Now he had to see if they were working properly. Erratic moves in the final flight path of the plane might hint at an engine problem. But because the FDR didn't have the data Garstang needed, he had to devise a clever way to reconstruct the plane's movements. He made a map showing the locations of witnesses when they heard the plane.
We used the location of witnesses on the ground, and through triangulating from where they are to where they either saw the aircraft or heard it, we were able to determine that the general flight path was in an arc like this that approached towards the airport in this direction, and then ultimately the plane crashed over here.
Witnesses determined the flight showed no sign of trouble, and they provided Garstang with other useful information.
Initially, we heard that the witnesses heard noises or sounds like a wowing change in pitch that made us wonder whether there was possibly an engine problem or a propeller problem. And at the crash site, we were missing pieces, and there's an extensive damage done to the right engine that initially led us to try and focus in that area to see if that was an area of concern.
Engine trouble is often the cause of small plane crashes. To see if it was behind this accident, Chief Analyst Bill Taylor dissected the battered engines.
When we're doing an engine investigation and doing a teardown, there are 2 or 3 things that we're looking for. First of all, we want to see whether there's been a mechanical failure in the engine. That's most apparent, most obvious, and the easiest thing to do. The second is to look for evidence of the power level. That's very helpful in an accident investigation to discover whether the engine was producing full power. It may be running, but running at low level, at idle, as you might say. It gives an indication, again, of what was available to the crew at that time.
If the engine was at full power when it crashed, it would bear the scars of its moving parts as they struck the engine body. Deep markings indicated the engines were at high power. The large amount of dirt and debris sucked into it on impact confirmed that finding. Taylor gave the engines a clean bill of health. He determined the wowing sounds heard by witnesses were normal engine sounds bouncing off the uneven terrain. He'd have to look elsewhere for answers. He checked the landing gear. It too was working. It was nearly retracted at the time of the crash, consistent with the procedure for an aborted landing. So far, the plane seemed in perfect working order. No clues had surfaced. Investigators were stymied. But was it possible something was driving the pilot to land quickly and take risks? Could he have been running out of fuel? John Garstang used infrared photography to find out.
What we have here on the left is a conventional color photograph of the forest, and on the right is what's referred to as a near-infrared photograph.
In conventional photography, fuel blends into the natural shadow. But shot with near-infrared film, the spray of fuel appears as a dark stain.
Records like the weight and balance gave us a good indication of what the fuel quantity should be, and we used the infrared imagery to confirm that there was sufficient quantity or a large quantity of fuel present. We have the ground scar here left by the right wing, and you can see a general area of discoloration where the fuel has been sprayed, as well as there's been a ground fire and branches have been broken.
The photographs revealed the plane arrived at the airport with fuel to spare. Another dead end for the investigators. According to all indications, Flight 70 should never have crashed. But it did. And until investigators figured out why, the tragedy could recur. The nagging question remained. After aborting the landing, why would the pilot start to climb and then dive into the earth? Engineer Jim Foots checked the accuracy of the aircraft's instruments. Perhaps they were lying.
Well, we look at the instruments, and which leads to looking at the dial faces and in the internal mechanisms of the instruments, because again, not all FDRs record all parameters. So we can look at the instruments and at times get information from the dial face, such as pointer slaps, gear train damage, and they will tell us what that actual system was doing at impact.
If the impact was severe enough, the pointer would slap against the dial face and leave a mark. Even if the pointer was lost, the telltale mark would remain. Most of the instruments were destroyed beyond recognition. Only the altimeter survived, and it showed the plane's altitude setting was right where it should have been. The pilot should have known how close to the ground he was. Once again, the solution remained elusive. But Foots had his suspicions. If the plane was going down, a warning system should have alerted the pilot, unless the warning system itself was faulty. He directed his attention to the warning lights. Light bulb filaments can tell a great deal about conditions at the moment a plane crashes.
Well, we do light bulb analysis, even if the aircraft does have an FDR or CVR. If the FDR gives us an indication that there was a problem, a warning, then we can look at the light bulbs and actually say, yeah, this light was on, and that the pilot did have a warning or a caution light.
A bulb that's lit when it's broken reacts very differently than a bulb that's off. It's easy for the trained eye to spot the difference.
What we're looking at here is the filaments. And what we look for with the filaments is deformation, as you see here, total uncoiling of the filament, which is indicative of a hot or illuminated filament when impacted, as opposed to a lamp that was off or cold at impact, where we have just a straight brittle fracture.
Foots found that none of the 37 surviving warning bulbs from Flight 70 had been on. But that didn't necessarily mean all was well with the craft. Still searching for clues, investigators focused again on the position of the aircraft. While attempting to abort the landing, perhaps the plane's nose tilted too high. At a steep angle, air can't glide easily over the wings. The plane stalls and drops from the sky. In order to figure out if Flight 70 stalled, investigators would have to climb into the pilot's seat. Whatever happened to Skylink Flight 70 came without warning. Now investigators had to reconstruct the tragedy. The stall avoidance system on this type of aircraft was notoriously unforgiving. It provided very little notice to the pilot before a stall. At low altitude, the difference between stall and crash, and life and death, is mere seconds. To see if the plane's pitch, or angle in the air, would cause a stall, investigators needed to reconstruct its final moments. For that, they needed a flight simulator. They fed in all the data they collected, along with pilot commands from the voice recorder. The simulator would combine these disconnected clues into a close estimate of the plane's position.
We knew what the altitude and airspeed of the aircraft was at the start of the missed approach. We also knew when they added the power, when they retracted the landing gear, and when they retracted the flaps. So we were able to come into the simulator and use those parameters that were available off the flight data recorder and fly the airplane in accordance with those parameters, and then through that process determine what the pitch attitude of the aircraft was.
If the pitch was too steep, the plane would have stalled, then crashed. But that wasn't what happened. The simulator showed the plane's pitch was fine. Stalling, and a faulty stall avoidance system were ruled out. After a tireless examination of the plane from nose to tail, investigators could finally rule out mechanical failure. They had only one more place to find answers, with the man in the cockpit. To determine if human error was at fault, Roger Ayotte needed to get inside the pilot's head.
Once we had eliminated the possibility of mechanical malfunction of the aircraft, and that was probably a couple of months into the investigation, then we were able to focus all of our efforts on the operational and human performance sides of the accident.
While one type of investigator searches for physical clues, another looks for psychological ones. Black box expert Mike Poole created a voice print, turning emotion into a picture. And human performance investigators Ron Coleman and Beth McCullough were brought in to study it. To explore what was going on in the minds of the pilots, they scrutinized their final words.
Descending. Okay. Descending.
So his first response
First one's casual.
is,
Yes.
Okay, no big deal, but
The second one's got a lot of anxiety in it.
When the co-pilot alerted the pilot they were descending, the pilot answered calmly with a simple okay. McCullough felt there was far more going on than the first playback led them to believe.
But if you've got someone next to you who's obviously expressing concern and in a rather agitated voice, then you begin to wonder, and that might be your first question, is this captain being really calm about the situation, has it fully under control, or is he unaware of the gravity of the situation?
Descending. Okay. Descending.
First thing that we picked up was the anxiety in the co-pilot's voice when he uttered the second descending. After that, we went back, listened to the entire tape many, many times to try and determine the various operational issues that might have emerged or did emerge, and also some of the human performance issues that were clear just from listening to the voices and the pauses and the hesitation.
From the voice recording, Coleman and McCullough surmised that the pilot sounded unconcerned, oblivious to the fact that he was speeding towards certain death. They ruled out suicide. Psychological profiles were normal. The investigation team suspected the pilot was literally lost in the clouds. He didn't know which way was up. And he wasn't trusting his instruments or his co-pilot to set him straight. Did pilot error cause the crash? The team was close to figuring it out. But before they could, more testing was necessary. Was the pilot of Flight 70 truly disoriented in the fog? To illustrate what he might have experienced, Mike Poole collated the data and produced an animated version of the fatal flight. Next to it, he created an illusion plane. It was based on what the human performance experts believe the pilot may have perceived.
columnist approach, he asks for the gear to come up, the gear is selected up, he calls for the flaps to come up, and the first officer has responded with flaps coming up to half.
Shrouded by fog, unable to see the runway, the pilot searches for visual clues outside his window. In his efforts to get his bearings, he fails to notice his gauges or to heed his co-pilot's concern.
What we know, and from our operational investigators suspect, that he is maybe adjusting the throttles in the cockpit, he's maybe unfamiliar with his flight director, he's in fog, he's perhaps a little bit lost in respect to where exactly is the runway, is it to my right, is it to my left? So all these factors can be distracting him from that task of watching those instruments.
The animation showed that the pilot did indeed confuse up with down. The condition is called somatographic illusion. It occurs when pilots are deprived of visual cues. Instead, they rely on gut instinct.
Basically, the human body cannot distinguish the difference between a force through your stomach pushing against the back of your chair due to thrust, due to being accelerated down a runway, for example, or the same force due to pitching you up and feeling the effects of gravity pushing you back in the chair.
Though the pilot may have been operating under an illusion, the consequences of his actions were dreadfully real. Investigators went back to the simulator to experience for themselves Flight 70's fatal illusion. A simulator is an excellent place to perform a test for illusions because it's a machine that's been built to trick the eye and mind.
In a simulator, you're in a building, and obviously it can't accelerate you down a runway. But it wants to make you feel that. So to achieve that, what they do is they tilt you back in your chair, and you feel the force of gravity in your chair, and then they fool your visual senses by taking the horizon. Instead of you would normally see it rise, they actually keep it level. So your eyes think the horizon's level, you're feeling this force through your stomach into the back of the chair. That is the sensation of accelerating down the runway, and that essentially is the somatographic illusion.
Roger Ayotte took the mock fatal flight. All the data were entered and the horizon taken away so he could feel the sensation as the pilot had. But he'd fly under instrument flight rules, or IFR, relying totally on his gauges so he would know where the plane was relative to the ground.
Okay, and this is the same approach being conducted in IFR conditions. So you have to concentrate totally on your instruments, and as you can see, you have no visual references outside the cockpit.
With his view blocked, he couldn't tell if he was going up or down while accelerating, but the gauges told him he was heading toward the ground. The simulated flight proved that the pilot had fallen victim to the illusion.
You can fly by the seat of your pants to a certain extent when you're in visual flight conditions, and that is done frequently. However, when you're in instrument flight conditions, so when you're flying in fog or cloud or something like that, then you don't have those visual senses that you do when you're flying visually.
The forces of motion in 3 dimensions can play tricks on the mind. The inner ear regulates balance and lets us know where we stand, but it needs a visual reference. It's extremely difficult to overpower the human instinct to rely on vision when flying. But through sheer willpower, a pilot can stay true to the instruments until his mind overcomes his body. Unfortunately, the pilot of Flight 70 wasn't aware of the danger. It takes a network of complex systems to keep a plane in the air. It also takes a tangle of circumstances to send one crashing down. In both Roselawn, Indiana, and Terrace, British Columbia, a combination of factors conspired against the aircraft, dooming the passengers and crew. But aboard the planes were the black boxes. These indestructible witnesses, coupled with human ingenuity, determined what went wrong. By surviving a crash, black boxes enable us to prevent countless others. A missing man surfaces in a Texas swamp. Strapped to his chest is a chilling record of his final minutes. Texas Rangers hope it will help unravel a case of double homicide. Police have a suspect in a cold-blooded killing, just not the technology to match him to the crime. Will science catch up to the killer before he slips away for good? When a body appears on the side of a Texas interstate, detectives hit the road to stop a homicidal trucker in his tracks. In Texas, there's plenty of room to hide. But killers in the Lone Star State, be warned. Even the swiftest of criminals can't escape the long arm of the Texas Rangers. On July 27, 1982, Texas Rangers were called to an abandoned car in a remote drainage ditch near Santa Rosa. the inside had been torched. A check of the plates showed that the car was registered to Billy Staton, who, along with his girlfriend, Letty Castro, had been missing for 10 days. It was the first break in the case, and one that Rangers desperately needed. Once the car was pulled from the swamp, investigators noticed something even more suspicious. A rock had been set on the accelerator. It appeared that a deliberate attempt had been made to get rid of the car and conceal a crime. But the fire and days of exposure to the elements had erased all fingerprints and ruined any chance of linking the crime to a suspect. The rock was the only clue authorities had to lead them to the missing couple.
None near.
But if the condition of the car was any indication, things didn't look good for Billy Staton and Letty Castro. Texas Ranger Bruce Castile feared the worst.
Well, after finding the vehicle, we started an extensive search with numerous individuals searching canals, brushy areas in an attempt to find Letty Castro and Billy Staton. We felt like at that time that they had been murdered.
Rangers combed the area for the bodies, certain that they couldn't be too far from the scorched car. They trudged through miles of dense brush along the drainage ditch for any sign of the couple. After 4 days of searching, they still had found nothing. But the Rangers weren't discouraged. They'd built a reputation on their ability to solve extremely difficult cases. The Texas Rangers were organized in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin to protect the first settlers of Texas from Indians. 50 years later, in the rowdy days of the Wild West, the Rangers earned their name as tough lawmen by tracking down bandits, bank robbers, horse thieves, and cattle rustlers. Today, Rangers are as tenacious as ever. As a state police agency, they're highly trained in investigative and forensic techniques to assist local law enforcement. The Texas Rangers tackle only the biggest and most complex criminal cases. And the simple missing persons case was becoming more difficult with every day. Rangers questioned Letty Castro's brother, who told authorities that he last saw the couple on July 16th, when he stopped by the trailer she shared with Billy Staton. That was the same day they left to pick up Staton's 9-year-old daughter at his ex-wife's house. The two were going to be married soon and hoped to obtain full-time custody of the girl. But their dreams disappeared just as quickly as they did. The Rangers also learned from Letty Castro's brother of the Statons' ugly custody battle. Billy Staton retained rights to keep his daughter every other weekend. His ex-wife Sherry didn't like to comply. Pickups were an especially distressing time. On checking up on Staton's ex-wife, Rangers learned that Sherry and her new husband, Paul Wolf, had moved the day after Billy Staton and Letty Castro disappeared.
Probably within about 4 or 5 days, would be my guess.
When Rangers caught up with them, they claimed that Staton never showed up to pick up his daughter.
You bet. Just keep you posted, George. Good to see y'all. Take care. You bet.
The Rangers obtained a warrant to search the home that Paul and Sherry had vacated. A damp spot on the carpet encouraged detectives to probe a little further. What they found was puzzling. A small area on the back side of the carpet had been painted over. It seemed like a deliberate attempt had been made to cover something up. Sections of the carpet were shipped to the lab to see if technicians could determine anything. Agents tested the carpet. So they wouldn't destroy potential evidence, they removed some of the residue with a cotton swab. A chemical that changes color in the presence of blood was then added to the swab. The test was positive. The blood was human. Because of the limits of technology in 1982 and the contamination by the paint, they could not determine whose blood it was. But they discovered that the carpet contained a lot of it, and someone had gone to a lot of trouble to hide it. Upon closer examination at the house, investigators discovered tiny spatters of blood on the walls and curtains. They collected samples to send to the lab. If the bodies were ever found, the blood types could be compared. Something had definitely happened in the house. But the most interesting piece of evidence was found outside the home. It wasn't so much evidence as the absence of evidence, but it was rock solid. Ranger criminalist Joe Marchand uncovered precisely what had happened.
And we looked around and we finally found an indentation next to a tree where a rock used to be. So we went ahead and we had the rock at the time, and we went back and we basically fit it back as a jigsaw puzzle and put it back in its place.
Putting these pieces together, the Rangers turned to Paul Wolf, the husband of Billy Staton's ex-wife. This time, he changed his story. Paul now admitted that Billy and Letty Castro had arrived to pick up Billy's daughter. He told Rangers that Sherry and the girl weren't home when Billy arrived. Billy was so mad to find that his daughter wasn't there that he attacked Paul. Paul tried to defend himself and accidentally killed Billy with a metal bar. Billy's fiancée, Letty, heard the commotion and came running in. When she saw Billy on the floor covered with blood, she came after Paul. Once again, Paul Wolf said he beat her in self-defense, accidentally killing her too. Shocked and scared by what he'd done, Paul asked a buddy, Glenn Henderson, to help him dump the bodies in a drainage ditch. To get rid of Billy's car, he'd brought a large rock along to set on the accelerator, hoping to get the car to drive itself into the ditch. But it hadn't worked the way he'd planned, so he returned the next day and burned it. Paul Wolf admitted that he had lied the first time because he was confused and wasn't sure the Rangers would buy his story. Wolf then directed investigators to the bodies. Letty Castro's body was found floating in a drainage ditch 12 miles from where the car was located. Her skull showed the damage Paul Wolf described. But Rangers also saw that she'd been shot in the head. It didn't match Wolf's confession. Clearly, he was lying. About 10 miles away, Billy Staton's body was found partially submerged in a steep canal. His head was crushed. When the body was dragged out, the detectives made a peculiar discovery. Under his shirt, strapped around his waist, was a mini tape recorder. It was in bad shape from the water, but the cassette inside was still intact. It was a puzzling find. Rangers couldn't explain why Billy wore a tape recorder to his ex-wife's house, but they knew there was the possibility that Billy Staton had recorded his own murder. The Texas Rangers believed that the clue that would seal their case was taped to Billy Staton's body. The tape recorder found on the victim was treated with tremendous care. Days of water and mud had ruined most of the mechanism. But crime scene analyst Joe Marchand was hopeful about salvaging the cassette.
The most fascinating piece of evidence that we found was the tape recorder that was strapped to Billy Staton's stomach. We pulled the tape out. We called the FBI laboratory and asked them, what are we supposed to do? And they said, has it been submerged in water? Partially. They said, good, put it back in water and send it to us in a container. And it's better to be in water than letting the tape dry out.
After 10 long days, the tape was returned to the Texas Rangers. The FBI had done their best to save whatever had been recorded, but it was still uncertain whether it contained anything vital to the case. Within seconds of playing it, the sounds of Billy Staton being brutally murdered were perfectly clear. Armed with the recording, investigators went back to the scene of the crime to precisely match actions to audio. They measured distances and timed out the events as they corresponded to the sounds on the tape. The blood found in the house had been matched to Billy Staton. Now the patterns of the blood would tell more of the story. All the bloodstains on the wall had tiny tails, like teardrops. By studying and measuring those tails, examiners could determine exactly what angles the blood had come from. Combined with the audio tape, they could then piece together where Billy was in the room at the time he was beaten.
Now I want you to go ahead and pass it on to Raul.
The tape revealed to investigators exactly what happened that afternoon. Billy Staton showed up at the house and was invited in.
Billy's here.
Sherry Wolf and her daughter are clearly heard on the tape, refuting Paul's claims that they weren't home when Billy arrived. Detectives learned that soon after Billy's arrival, Wolf took out the trash. But the trash was just an excuse to get outside. He really just wanted to see if Billy had brought Letty with him, and he needed to grab the crowbar he'd hidden earlier. From the way the blood had spattered on the walls, and by listening carefully to the tape, it was obvious to Rangers that Billy Staton had no idea what was about to happen. He was seated, waiting patiently, when Paul Wolf struck. Wolf's accomplice, Glenn Henderson, had been hiding in another room. Once their victim was slumped on the floor, the two went out to murder Letty, who was waiting in the car. Without a doubt, Paul Wolf's self-defense plea was a lie. These were cold-blooded attacks on unsuspecting people. While the tape continued to roll, the killers carried Billy out to his car and put him in the trunk. They knew they'd need to get rid of the car, as well as the bodies, and they took the rock with them. The fact that the murder weapons were planted and an accomplice was on hand helped to prove that these weren't spur-of-the-moment murders. They were planned in advance. Of course, what they didn't plan on was capturing their crime on tape.
And this is where they're looking. This is where they're looking to see where they're going to dump Letty. And you can hear the rocks hitting the bottom of the trunk, and they're traveling slow speed.
Wolf found a secluded area off a drainage ditch a few miles from the house. Glenn Henderson followed in his truck. The site was far off the road, and the grass was high enough to conceal a dead body. But something was wrong. Letty Castro was still alive. The killers, however, were prepared for such a hitch.
On the tape you hear a single gunshot, then you hear some yelling, which is inaudible. Then you hear the car door close in the vehicle and take off, and approximately 30 seconds later the tape runs out.
For some reason, they decided not to dump both bodies at the same spot. They left their next victim 9 miles down the road. The car was disposed of just as Wolf had described. The hard work was over. Back at the house, there was quite a bit of cleaning to do. In the short time they'd left their victim inside, struggling for life, a large pool of blood had collected on the carpet. The co-conspirators had to rent a professional carpet cleaner to cover their tracks. But even that wasn't enough. Blood had seeped through the carpet, staining the underside. In an attempt to conceal it, they painted over the spots. To put the crime behind them, the Wolfs went so far as to move out of the house the day after the murders. But nothing they could do would erase the evidence that Billy Staton had unwittingly recorded. Rangers discovered that Billy had worn the recorder on his lawyer's advice. He'd wanted to capture the appalling confrontation and Sherry's malicious behavior, hoping it could help him obtain custody of his daughter. Instead, he recorded his own murder. Paul and Sherry Wolf were both sentenced to life in prison for killing Billy Staton and Letty Castro. For his part, Glenn Henderson also received a life sentence. Most criminals unintentionally leave evidence behind, evidence that can condemn. But sometimes the proof is worthless. When even the latest technology can't finger a killer, all detectives can do is wait until science catches up. It was the morning of January 22nd, 1988, when Texas Rangers were summoned to a secluded farmhouse in Burleson County. They'd been called to check up on an elderly woman who lived by herself. Neighbors couldn't reach her on the phone. There was concern that something might have happened. They were right. 72-year-old Lydia Schumacher had been murdered. Inside, Rangers discovered the gruesome scene. Schumacher lay partially nude on her bed. The sheets were bloody. She'd been bludgeoned and then smothered to death. The Texas Ranger Crime Lab in Austin was called in to process the house for evidence. Someone had clearly broken in the back door, and it seemed some jewelry was missing. Apparently, Mrs. Schumacher had surprised a burglar. There were no fingerprints to be collected, and the weapon used to beat her couldn't be found. It was likely that she was smothered with her own pillow. Officers turned their attention to the body and the bed. Serologist Donna Stanley, an expert in biological evidence, examined the crime scene and found signs that the victim had been raped.
So what we then did was we began to unravel the bed sheet by sheet. and from doing that, we recovered any hair that we saw on the sheets and the bedspread. That was where it became apparent at that moment that we might have been dealing more with more than just with a homicide, that we might have had a sexual assault involved.
To track down the killer, rangers began interviewing people in the area for any information. Within a week, rangers had questioned all of Schumacher's friends and neighbors. No one could understand who could rape and murder such a sweet old woman. But eventually, 3 names came up of men who, for one reason or another, were considered suspicious by their neighbors. Detectives asked the men if they'd be willing to take a polygraph test. One by one, they were brought into the station, hooked up to the machine, and asked point blank if they murdered Schumacher or had any knowledge of the murder. Texas Ranger Bob Cannell was in charge of the case.
We had several suspects in the course of the investigation. One of them was a next-door neighbor, and another one was a person who was later picked up for indecent exposure.
2 men were questioned and released. The third suspect was a young man named Charles Supak Jr. Supak and his father had actually been doing some work at the Schumacher house on the day she was murdered. A background check revealed he'd once been charged with sexual assault. He was subjected to a thorough interrogation about the crime, but he denied any involvement whatsoever. The polygraph confirmed that Supak was telling the truth.
No, sir.
All 3 suspects had passed the test, and rangers were now left empty-handed. With no more leads, all they could do was hope to make the best of what they had so far.
Pretty good.
At the crime lab in Austin, Donna Stanley and her colleagues ran tests on the biological evidence left by the rapist.
Characteristics in the hair that I feel very.
Once they determined the killer's blood type, they compared it to hair samples taken from the 3 suspects.
The medullary structure, the cuticle.
Out of the 3 suspects that I tested, 2 of them were immediately eliminated. The third remained as an inclusion in the blood typing test, and that was Supak. He was not eliminated on ABO typing.
In 1988, ABO blood typing narrowed down evidence to one of only 8 blood types. But with hundreds of millions of people sharing Supak's type, the test results were hardly enough to prove anything. Still, it was all they had to work with, so rangers brought Supak in again. He had passed the first polygraph test, but investigators were confident that if he were guilty, Supak couldn't beat the machine twice in a row. They decided to try again. It wasn't difficult finding him. He was sitting in jail for possession of marijuana. Rangers felt that if he'd been under the influence of drugs during the first test, he could have possibly lied and still passed.
On the second go-round, he had been in jail for several days, and we knew that he had to be clean at that time. So we took him back for the second polygraph to the same operator, and he passed that one too.
No other evidence was found that could pin the murder on Supak. Authorities had no choice but to clear him of the charges. For nearly a year, rangers struggled to find Schumacher's killer, but it was hopeless. On November 29, 1988, they finally had to suspend the case. A rapist and murderer roamed somewhere in the Lone Star State, and the Texas Rangers were powerless to stop him. It had been 3 years since Lydia Schumacher was brutally raped and murdered. The only suspect was cleared of all responsibility, and the case sat on the shelf collecting dust. But by 1991, science had advanced enough to warrant another look at the case. Serologist Donna Stanley from the Texas Ranger Crime Lab felt that the new technologies held promise.
We still had a little bit of evidence left, kind of hanging on to it, hoping that as a new technology came along, we might then be able to apply this evidence to that new technology and gain, yet again, some more information. I need to pull that file for some new
The first comparisons made between suspect Charles Supak's hair and body fluids found at the crime scene had been inconclusive. Forensic examiners had done all they could do. But since the initial investigation, a revolutionary new method for analyzing DNA had been developed. Called PCR, it enables scientists to get DNA from tiny samples, like a single strand of hair or a speck of blood, something they could never do before. Stanley was optimistic that the evidence collected from the Schumacher house 3 years earlier could finally be used to nail the killer.
Okay, see you around.
Shortly after the case had closed, Sheriff Cannell had retired, and Texas Ranger Ray Kaufman took his place. Kaufman approved further investigation of the evidence and quickly reopened the file.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob.
At the time I got involved in the Schupak murder, I knew that DNA was making giant leaps in their ability to narrow down suspects, and I felt that this case was one that possibly DNA could help solve.
As the preserved evidence was sent to a genetics lab, Rangers began questioning neighbors and relatives again, hoping to uncover more information about Charles Supak. They soon learned things about their suspect they'd never heard before. Shocking facts that made authorities only more suspicious than ever. Neighbors confided that Supak had quite a disturbing reputation. It was widely reported that he had unusual sex habits, including bestiality. But the most helpful information came from a man who recalled a strange and frightening night with Charles Supak. About 4 months after the murder, John Golson was awakened late one night by Charles Supak. He told Golson that he'd had car trouble and needed help. But something about Supak's manner didn't seem right. John reluctantly agreed to drive him back to his car.
Where are we going? Man, just go on out this way.
While they drove around aimlessly, trying to find the car, Golson's suspicions slowly turned to fear. Supak had insisted on sitting directly behind Golson and spent the entire drive idly wrapping an electrical cord around his hands. Supak finally directed Golson to a remote area, but when they arrived, his vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Tired of the whole affair, Golson finally drove him to a garage. When Golson got home, he still felt uneasy. He and his wife inspected the grounds and found that their phone lines had been cut. The story took another chilling twist when Golson showed Rangers where he'd driven Supak that night. Golson had no idea of the significance of the spot, but its importance didn't escape the Rangers. Golson's trip with Supak led Rangers to believe that their old suspect knew more about the Schumacher murder than he'd admitted.
This is the final location where Mr. Schupak brought Mr. Golson that night. Schupak said he'd parked his vehicle down or got it stuck down here by this tree line. This little lane here goes down to the Schumacher residence. It's maybe a quarter of a mile right down here.
Supak had returned to the Schumacher estate. Rangers knew it was common for a killer to revisit the crime scene, But it would take more than this circumstantial evidence to put the finger on Charles Supak. The lab had run complex DNA tests, comparing Supak's sample to the evidence from the Schumacher case. Finally, on March 8, 1992, the results came in. The DNA of Charles Supak Jr. was in the victim's bed sheets. The updated information finally gave Texas Rangers the evidence they needed to arrest the man they'd suspected for over 5 years. Once again, he was in another Texas county jail for vehicle theft. Faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, Supak admitted to raping and murdering Lydia Schumacher. In his confession, Supak told Rangers that on January 20th, 1988, he and his father had finished some work they'd been doing around Mrs. Schumacher's house and were ready to call it a day. They'd spent nearly a week on the property, and Charles had been inside the house enough to know that Mrs. Schumacher owned some gold jewelry. He figured there had to be more valuables somewhere in the house. That night, Supak returned. He claimed he'd been driving around looking for something to steal when he thought of Mrs. Schumacher. Her house was terribly secluded, and she was elderly and defenseless. The house was quiet when he arrived, and getting in was easy. He'd left a pipe in the yard that day. Now it was the perfect tool, and soon it would be the perfect weapon. Once inside, the prowler had a look around. He snuck into her bedroom and began rifling through her things when she awoke. Supak reacted by beating her in the head with the pipe. Before he left, he raped her and suffocated her with a pillow. It took nearly 5 years, but Charles Supak Jr. was finally convicted and sentenced to life for the murder of Lydia Schumacher. The conviction was a tribute to Ranger tenacity, as much as it was a victory of hard science.
Forensic science basically solved this case. If it hadn't been for the advances in DNA, I'm sure this would still be a pending case that would go unsolved.
It's easier to catch a killer, even years after his crime, if he stays put. But Rangers take pride in their ability to track down suspects on the run. In a state as big as Texas, it's a common situation. There's usually not much to see on Interstate 35 between Dallas and Oklahoma. But on August 8, 1994, that changed. A Cook County police officer spotted a body on the roadside near the Oklahoma state line. When Texas Rangers arrived on the scene, they found a dead white male in his 30s. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, neck, and face. Wrapped around his neck was a shoelace. There was a sock stuffed in his mouth. Judging from the condition of his body, it looked like he had been thrown from a moving vehicle. A bra and a baseball cap were discovered nearby. A pair of men's underwear were also recovered. They were obscure clues, but it was enough to start Rangers down the right road. Officers searched the body, but found no wallet or ID. The murder victim was transported to the lab, where fingerprints were taken for identification. The task of tracking down the killer fell to Texas Ranger Johnny Waldrop. Within 2 days, he received a positive identification of the victim from the fingerprints. He was a 38-year-old Dallas man. His name was James Sykes.
James Sykes had a real bad criminal history and was just a kind of a throwaway person. He didn't have any family background other than his parents, and had no money and had no job, and was a very bad drug addict and an extensive criminal history. Roadblocks we ran into is through the investigation. We would contact people and they would say, "Why do you care?" Well, we did care because he was an individual just like everyone else.
Door.
Sykes hung with a rough crowd. When officers tracked down his best friend, Murray Bracken, he was in a Dallas County jail on a drug charge, and he became the Rangers' first suspect. Bracken admitted that he'd been with Sykes just the day before his body was discovered. He even acknowledged that the baseball cap found at the scene belonged to him. But he was adamant that he had nothing to do with the murder. Bracken recounted that he and Sykes were partying at a motel when they met a truck driver and his girlfriend. The four used up Bracken's drugs, and at the end of the party, he asked the truck driver to pay his share. The truck driver didn't have the money with him, but said he could go get it. James Sykes went with the couple to make sure they didn't just take off. That was August 7th.
Murray sent Sykes with the truck driver to collect the money. The truck driver, for some unknown reason, gave his billfold with his driver's license to Bracken and said, "I'm from Ada, Oklahoma. I'm a truck driver. I've got to be in Phoenix in a couple of days, and this is good faith. I will leave my billfold with you, showing you that I'll come back with the money."
They never returned. And Murray Bracken said he emptied the trucker's wallet and threw away his driver's license. Unfortunately, that was the one piece of evidence that would have supported his story and provided a solid lead for Rangers. Now it was gone forever. To see if Bracken was telling the truth, Waldrop called the Oklahoma Department of Motor Vehicles to check for truckers who'd applied for duplicate licenses in the last few days. The DMV gave him a list. On it was a man named Terry Brown. He was from Ada, Oklahoma. Police records revealed that Brown had been stopped on a traffic violation shortly before the murder. At the time, he was driving a truck registered to a freight company in Carrollton, Texas. He finished his job and returned the truck to the company. But shortly afterwards, someone stole it off the lot. Brown was arrested for driving the stolen rig 2 days later, but was released on bond. Dallas police sent Waldrop his mugshot.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Rangers put the picture in a stack of photos and asked Murray Bracken to survey the lineup. Within moments, he recognized the trucker he'd last seen with his friend. He pointed out Terry Brown. The investigation was picking up steam, but to prove Brown was the killer, Rangers needed more than just the word of a criminal. They needed proof. The freight company was relieved to get their stolen truck back. Only now it was the major piece of evidence in a crime far worse than theft. It matched a description Bracken had given authorities, and they were beginning to believe that it was in the truck that James Sykes had taken his last ride. The Dallas Police Crime Lab was called in to search the vehicle for any signs that the victim had been inside. Rangers knew Brown had been in the cab. He was arrested in it. Trucking records showed he was driving on business until August 6th. Sometime after that, he returned to the lot and stole the truck. The company reported the rig missing, and it was recovered on the 8th, the same day the body was found. Everything pointed to Terry Brown as the killer, but Brown had jumped bail. No one knew where he was. The team scoured the cab and sleeper for clues. They got what they were looking for. In the back, on the walls, investigators found some small spots of what appeared to be blood. Careful examination revealed even more blood under the mattress. Some quick tests indicated that it was human. Detectives were sure that further testing would reveal it to be the blood of James Sykes. The evidence was bagged and sent to the lab for DNA testing. Rangers were confident they were now on the trail of the man responsible for the brutal stabbing. At the lab, criminalist Wilson Young used DNA testing to compare the blood to that of the victim. But what he found shocked Rangers and presented a major roadblock to the investigation.
We did a type on it, we did a DNA type on it, and found that actually from that rig that we investigated at that particular time, the blood didn't match the victim that we were looking for. We had some blood here, but didn't match the person we were supposed to match.
They'd found blood in the truck, but it wasn't the blood they'd expected to find. Apparently, someone else might possibly have been murdered there. Then Ranger Waldrop received news that only complicated issues further.
Another female was found, and she had a ligature around her neck and a sock in her mouth. And of course, we found Sykes with a ligature string around his neck, a sock in his mouth. So my initial gut reaction was that Murray Bracken was telling the truth, and that we probably have a serial killer out there driving a truck.
The case had taken an unexpected turn. At least 2 people were dead, and a serial killer was loose on the interstates of America. If Waldrop didn't catch up to him soon, there would almost certainly be more dead bodies to identify down the road. The Texas murders didn't stop. On November 7th, Ranger Waldrop received a call from police in Richardson, Texas, a town just north of Dallas. They'd just found another body. It was a woman with a string tied around her neck and a sock stuffed in her mouth. But this time, there was a twist. The dead woman was Terry Brown's mother. Brown and his girlfriend, Tina Sampson, were prime suspects in the murder. They had stolen his mother's car and disappeared. When Waldrop talked to Brown's last employer, he discovered that Brown was supposed to have delivered a load to California. He'd picked up their truck on November 6th, the day before the murder, and never returned. Once again, Terry Brown had stolen a rig and vanished.
We were very fortunate at this time. We finally had a turn of luck. This was the truck we were looking for. We found that he drove the truck to Oklahoma City and partied in it for a few days, and it ran out of gas and he left it. The Oklahoma City police found the truck abandoned.
Before Rangers had time to respond, the trucking company brought the semi back to Texas and had it cleaned. The crime lab was sent to search for any possible clues that might have survived the cleaning. Fortunately, the company hadn't wiped away all the evidence. Stains in the sleeper under the mattress were found that were most likely caused by blood. Judging by the size of the stains, it appeared that a lot of blood had seeped through the mattress onto the platform. But this was clearly a brand new mattress. The company had thrown out the old one, and with it some evidence vital to the murder case. Through a stroke of luck, the trash hadn't been collected yet, and among the trash was an old, stained mattress. The large stains looked like blood and matched the stains in the truck. But detectives were concerned that days of exposure had taken its toll on the evidence. Everything was shipped to a lab in Austin for detailed analysis. At the lab, DNA was extracted from the evidence. The strands were chemically cut into smaller pieces. This allowed for an extremely precise comparison between the blood found in the truck and the sample from James Sykes.
I'm going to need the light out.
By comparing the DNA fragments, technicians confirmed that the blood could match only one person in the entire world: James Sykes.
We were certain that the victim's blood was in the truck. In fact, I mean, when you look at the numbers, 1 in 5.5 billion, that pretty much indicates that that particular person was the only one that could leave the blood behind in the truck.
Terry Brown and Tina Sampson were found the next day. Dallas police caught up with the couple in his mother's stolen car, headed east.
We'll find that out in the court of law.
They were split up and interrogated separately.
She's telling the truth right now.
Once the evidence was presented before them, investigators were finally told the true story of what happened to James Sykes.
He was trying to rape Tina. She had him by knife point.
To make sure they paid what they owed, Sykes had gone with them to collect the money. Brown drove to a truck stop and told Sykes to wait in the truck while he went to get the cash. But Sykes grew impatient and decided to collect his money another way. According to the killers, he climbed in the back and demanded sex from Tina Sampson. She panicked and pulled a knife to defend herself. When Brown returned and saw the two arguing, he assumed Sykes was trying to rape his girlfriend. In a fit of anger, he grabbed the knife and stabbed Sykes. Sampson said she was so upset, she took the knife and stabbed him some more. Brown wrapped a ligature around his victim's neck and stuffed a sock in his mouth. Sampson said they left his body in the back for a while until they were ready to dispose of him.
And she told us about how they had driven around a couple of days later, had partied some more, done some more drugs while he was in the sleeper of the truck, and that they later decided to go to Oklahoma City. And along the route, she didn't know where they were, but they'd pulled up on the side of the interstate, and that Terry had got in the sleeper and just with his feet had pushed the body out the side door on the long side of the interstate, and then they went to Oklahoma City.
Though investigators couldn't get a conviction for the other two murders, Tina Sampson got 20 years for conspiracy to murder, and Terry Brown got life in prison for the death of James Sykes. The determination of the Texas Rangers paid off.
Well, this case, I think, epitomizes the Rangers that we have done for so many years. There's a very old Ranger saying that a man in the wrong cannot stand up against a man in the right that keeps on coming. And that's what we did in this case. We kept on coming.
The The Rangers made their reputation over 100 years ago by stubbornly chasing criminals through all sorts of terrain, using any weapon available. And they're still at it, armed with the power of forensic science. Killers may continue to run from the law, but with technology as their sidekick, the Texas Rangers will never stop their relentless pursuit. A serial killer is delivering death door to door. Detectives move in to stop him before he kills again.
Because I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Bodies begin turning up in Northern California. Investigators search for a common denominator and find a pattern of uncommon cruelty. For years, a deadly predator has taunted police while snaring victim after victim. With every kill, he grows bolder, while authorities grow more desperate to catch him. Serial killers don't stop on their own. As the body count rises, investigators must use all of their resources to put an end to their murder by numbers. Some of the names in this episode have been changed. January 12, 1990 was another beautiful day in San Diego. But Chris Burns wasn't enjoying it. He was growing concerned over the whereabouts of his fiancée. When his roommates came home, Burns asked if they'd seen Tiffany Schultz, who also shared the apartment.
No, I haven't seen her all day. Why? Because her car's downstairs.
Her car was in the parking lot, but in the several hours that Burns had been home, she hadn't appeared. The other roommates hadn't seen her either. Then they opened the door to a nightmare.
What's going on? Oh my God!
Schultz lay dead, partially disrobed and covered in blood.
You guys, call the cops! Get somebody here, all right?
Burns stayed with her while his roommates called police. As detectives interviewed Burns and his roommates, San Diego homicide investigators inspected the crime scene. One of the first things they noticed was that the body was posed, with outstretched arms and legs. Bruises indicated that the victim had struggled fiercely for her life. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. There was no sign of sexual assault. The answering machine tape was taken to check for suspicious messages. As the technicians continued working, Chris Burns told detectives his story.
And I put my hands up under her head like this to hold
They
her
noticed
head
his
so that I
hands
could-
and pants were marked with blood. The situation gave Sergeant Ed Petrick of the San Diego Police Homicide Unit grave doubts about Burns.
It seemed very odd to anybody that here would be a fellow that comes home, house is open, his girlfriend's nowhere around, but her keys are there, her car's there, her purse is there, but she's nowhere around. And there's a roommate's door to the bedroom that's closed, which is usually never closed, and he never bothers to knock or open it.
Burns was taken to the police station for further questioning about his fiancée's murder. He admitted that he and Schultz were having problems.
Let me tell you why I brought you in here.
The grisly slaying came at a time when they were supposedly trying to salvage their relationship. Lately, they couldn't get along. Now, Schultz was dead, and Burns looked like the main suspect.
And for 4 hours,
The blood on his clothes told police all they needed to know. But Burns claimed that the stain on his shirt came from touching Schultz after he discovered her dead. He believed the blood on his pants was his own, from a recent accident on the construction site where he worked. The story seemed too contrived. Chris Burns was arrested and charged with the murder of Tiffany Schultz.
I can do that.
It's not quite that.
Schultz's autopsy revealed she was stabbed nearly 60 times. While researching this brutal homicide case, police learned that the victim was paying her way through college by dancing at a nightclub.
Oh, yeah.
The manager confirmed that Schultz's relationship with Burns was tumultuous. She told police that he didn't want her working there. They often came to blows over it. Their last incident had been recent. Transcripts from the answering machine tape contained an apology from Burns for the hard time he gave his fiancée about her job. But police wondered if he'd lost his temper and his control one last time. Only careful forensic analysis of the evidence could determine if Schultz was the victim of Burns's rage. Burns's shirt and pants were sent to the lab to determine whose blood was on them. To better see the bloodstains, the jeans were turned inside out. When the results were positive, ABO blood typing was performed. The blood on the shirt matched Schultz's AB blood type.
But I'm sure we should.
But the blood on the pants was type O, Burns's own type. Serologist Larry Turner of the Jackson Police Department Crime Lab performed the analysis.
Based on what I found, I was able to determine that the story that Chris Burns had been telling, it was possible that it was true. The blood on his clothing matched him and not that of Tiffany Schultz, and on his t-shirt where he said he had been down to touch her and possibly gotten some of her blood on the t-shirt, that was correct as well.
Burns's story, as odd as it seemed, might be true. Police had no other evidence with which to hold him. He was released, though still considered the prime suspect. But police would soon regret releasing him. On February 16, 1990, 1 month after Tiffany Schultz was found murdered, police got another call to the same apartment complex.
Take a deep breath.
Another victim had been found, brutally murdered.
What do you have?
We got this one in the kitchen.
The partially nude body of Janine Weinhold, a student at San Diego State University, was discovered by her roommate. She had been stabbed several times. As in the Schultz case, the killer also posed this body with the legs outstretched. Police feared they were dealing with a serial killer.
There just wasn't any question in our minds that it had to be the same suspect. Just the body position, the stab wound clusters in the chest, just looked like the same murder, basically, different room.
This murder occurred only about 100 yards from the apartment where the first victim was killed. Blood-stained clothes were found on the floor by the bed. The killer left the murder weapon, a carving knife, in the sink. But he left something else even more important. Seminal fluid was found on the bedspread. It provided evidence that the victim had been raped. It also provided police with their best hope for learning the killer's identity. In the lab, Larry Turner tested the evidence. In the early 90s, DNA testing was beyond the scope of most labs. Turner would have to rely on the older and less precise blood typing tests. He found that all of the blood and bodily fluids tested positive for type O.
What we're going to do is just...
The blood evidence cast further suspicion on Chris Burns, the primary suspect, who had type O blood.
Take some of the material.
To be certain, Larry Turner analyzed the genetic markers within Burns's blood and in the fluid samples found at the murder scene. Genetic markers are inherited proteins that vary from individual to individual. While people may share some of the same ones, certain markers are more rare and can be used to make an ID. Genetic marker tests are dependable, but not nearly as precise as DNA. Turner found that the genetic markers of the suspect, Chris Burns, didn't match those taken from the second murder scene. That left investigators with 2 murders and no suspect.
Investigating the murder that occurred in the apartment complex.
They returned to the apartment complex and interviewed female residents to see if they'd seen anyone suspicious.
Okay, now what part
Police feared that these 2 victims were just the beginning.
When you came from the car?
3400 Claremont Drive, that's right.
Detectives created a list of over 1,000 suspects from the leads they gathered from the victims' friends and acquaintances.
About a block away. There's a couple of burglaries.
With 2 murders unsolved, the police were casting a wide net, trying to find their man before he killed again. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. On April 3rd, 1990, 2 months after the Weinhold murder, police received an urgent call. A woman had been found brutally stabbed.
Is this a house or an apartment, sir? Sir, you need to calm down for me if you can. Okay, where is the suspect at in this?
A witness saw a man with a knife fleeing the scene, his face covered by a t-shirt.
Can you tell me, did he have the knife with him?
Police rushed to respond. They met Tammy Ho, who returned from the apartment swimming pool and found her friend, Holly Tarr, mortally wounded with a single stab through the heart. Holly Tarr's murder occurred in the same apartment building where the second victim, Janine Weinhold, was killed. Outside, police discovered the knife and the t-shirt held by the killer as he fled the scene. They also found a shoe print left in the mud, which they thought belonged to the suspect. Unfortunately, eyewitnesses couldn't identify him.
The girlfriend, Tammy, she basically couldn't give any description at all. Just, it was a male, you know, saw a flash go by. She couldn't help in that area. We had a second witness who at least pinned down the race of the suspect as being a black male.
The knife and t-shirt were clean of fingerprints or hair samples. After 3 murders, all investigators knew for sure was that the victims were all white females between the ages of 18 and 21, left semi-nude, posed with their legs outstretched and stabbed in the heart. All they knew about the killer was that he might be an African American. Because the slayings took place in the area of San Diego known as Claremont, the murderer was dubbed the Claremont Killer. A deadly predator, a serial killer, was on the loose. Police looked at their list of more than 1,000 suspects and, from those, re-interviewed all of their African American suspects again. Hundreds of blood and saliva samples were voluntarily obtained. While the samples were being tested, the killing continued. On May 22, 1990, another woman was murdered in her apartment in Mid-City, San Diego. The pattern of stab wounds was similar to the previous 3 murders. The Claremont Killer was on the move. 4 months later, 43-year-old Pamela Clark and her 18-year-old daughter Amber were found murdered in their San Diego home. Both partially nude bodies bore stab wounds around the heart and were posed like the previous victims.
There was no question after the double murder of the Clarks that things really got heated up. We had politicians show up at the mobile command post. I had detectives hadn't had a day off in 40 days, which was no problem. You know, we had to catch this guy. But we were back to square one.
Police had a terrifying killer on the loose with few clues and no idea of where he might strike next. Time was against them. Each day he ran free, more women were in danger. The Claremont killer laid low for 5 months, leaving San Diego investigators with nothing to go on. The trail heated up again on February 3rd, 1991, more than a year after he had made his first kill. Linda Parker, age 23, was about to take a shower when she heard noises at her front door. She looked through the peephole and saw a man trying to slip the lock. Linda Parker fled through her back door. She went to a neighbor's apartment, and together they confronted the would-be intruder,
Hey, buddy, what are you doing? Oh. I was trying to get into my friend's apartment.
who mumbled an excuse as he left.
Wrong building.
Parker's neighbor noted the make and model of the man's car. Meanwhile, Parker called police, reporting a possible encounter with the Claremont killer. Parker suspected the man at her door had stalked her from a nearby gym. A previous victim, Pamela Clark, had worked out at the same gym right before her murder. Perhaps this was the killer's current spot for scouting victims. Officers distributed flyers and asked people at the gym if they had seen the man or the vehicle that Parker described. The next day, they received a call. Someone had spotted the man on the flyers sitting in his car outside the gym. Police apprehended the suspect. His name was Cleophas Prince. Police had interviewed him months earlier. He had declined to provide a blood sample. Police needed a sample if they hoped to compare Prince's DNA to crime scene evidence. To win his consent, they didn't let on that he was a murder suspect. They told him he was arrested for the attempted burglary of Linda Parker's home the prior day. Investigators checked his credit cards. Each had the marks of having been used to slip door locks. Prince cooperated and provided a blood sample without detectives having to resort to a warrant. Until the DNA results came back, police didn't have enough evidence to hold him. Prince was released, but he was kept under close surveillance. The blood sample was rushed to testing. If successful, the DNA would provide more solid evidence than genetic markers would. The problem was that in the early 90s, the technology was new, and it could take a year before the results came back. With nothing to hold the suspect, he would be free to kill again. With time running against them, investigators relied on a less comprehensive but faster test that would compare similarities between the sample and the crime scene DNA. If similarities existed, investigators could assume they were on the right track. If the DNA bore no superficial resemblance, they had the wrong man. Within a month, the results came back. The test indicated a match.
We just were, almost in tears. There was just unbelievable emotion involved in working with something and dealing with the families and all those crime scenes, and it was over.
Prince was located and arrested. Police were now able to gather more evidence and buy more time to run complete DNA tests. In Prince's possession were 2 rings that belonged to one of the victims. Police also found shoes with soles that matched the print left at a murder scene.
Hey, what's going on, bud?
Though police would never know what triggered his homicidal rage, they had a good idea of how his crimes evolved. Having perfected his craft as a burglar, he expanded his repertoire to include assault, rape, and murder. He tracked his victims from the gym and the pool, knowing that soon after they entered their apartments, they would be vulnerable while taking a shower. Prince would then break into their apartments and assault and stab them. Based on evidence gathered at the scenes, Prince was convicted of 6 murders. He awaits execution at San Quentin. Cleophas Prince actively sought his victims. Other serial killers wait for their prey to come to them. On May 3, 1983, in San Francisco, 2 55-gallon barrels were found in Golden Gate Park. Police had been called to the scene by 2 hikers who reported a foul odor coming from the barrels. Police suspected they might contain human remains. They were wrapped in plastic, their lids sealed with cement, but one was leaking.
You get?
They were taken to police headquarters where they were x-rayed before they were opened so as not to disturb any evidence inside. The x-rays were sent to Dr. Boyd Stevens, chief medical examiner for the city and county of San Francisco.
One of the barrels had 2 bodies in it, and that was evident by 2 complete skeletons, including skulls and spinal columns, etc. One of the barrels had 1 body in it. We couldn't tell the sex at that time, but we could see that there were dental fillings, metal material consistent with bullet fragments or jackets, as well as identifying personal items like rings or earrings and so forth.
Now that they knew human remains were inside the barrels, investigators had to determine how they got there. Technicians took their time looking for any clues the killer might have left. Kenneth Moses, an inspector at the San Francisco Crime Lab, began by examining the exterior of the barrels. He hoped he could find some sort of print on the packaging or the tape. But getting clean fingerprints off tape can be tricky.
More oil.
Powder won't work because it sticks to everything. And most fingerprint chemicals dissolve the adhesive, destroying the print. Moses tried an experiment. By combining a dark blue dye, an antibiotic, and water, he concocted a dye called crystal violet. He hoped that when the tape was dipped into the solution, the antibiotic would stick to the protein left on a fingerprint, staining it purple.
After 14 hours of labor slowly processing each strip of tape as it came off, we finally got down around 15 or 20 layers of tape to the last layer. Now, no prints were on any of those hundreds of yards of tape. Finally, we peel off the last piece of tape, put it into the crystal violet, and poof, up comes this beautiful fingerprint.
A simple magnifying glass revealed another crucial discovery. Presumably, the killer left a clear fingerprint behind in the fresh cement as he sealed one of the barrels. A synthetic polymer was mixed and carefully spread over the print. When it dried, it formed a near-perfect cast, which was then used to make a record of the print on paper. After 4 days of gathering all they could from the barrel's exteriors, investigators were ready to open them. One yielded the bodies of two nude females who'd been tied together. The women were later identified through their fingerprints as Glenda Wheatley and Paula Rodriguez, two prostitutes. Rodriguez worked for Thomas Michaels, identified as the clothed male victim in the other barrel. Each had been shot in the head. The victims had been ID'd, but the identity of their killer remained a mystery. Police spoke with friends of the victims, but none could shed any light on who could have done this. Investigators also ran the prints, but came up with no matches. 3 months after the barrels were found, a man driving on a rural road in California's San Mateo County, just outside of San Francisco, made a similarly gruesome discovery. He immediately summoned police. He led them to a bound female body with what looked like a bullet wound to the head. A grim trail of shredded clothing punctuated the horrific scene. Detective Sergeant Robert Morse deduced what it meant.
I need for you to go down to the... She had nylon rope extending from both of her ankles, and it appeared as though she had been dragged down the road. And we later measured off the distance, and she had indeed been dragged for 1.9 miles.
15 foot part of the sweater, blouse.
The entire area was secured, and each bit of evidence carefully noted. A garbage bag was found near the probable starting point of the brutal dragging. The first task after collecting all of the evidence was to identify the victim. Detectives ran a check on her fingerprints. She was identified as Marcia Geary, a prostitute from Oakland, California. Now, police knew her name. The next question was, how did she die?
The autopsy revealed that she had been shot in the back of the head, the trajectory going downward approximately 45 degrees. The entrance wound was an oblong shape, which is a little bit unusual.
The nylon-coated .38 caliber bullet recovered from the victim was also unusual. It had none of the lands and grooves that a gun barrel usually etches on a slug as it passes through. Police were baffled by what kind of weapon could have fired the fatal shot. The garbage bag from the crime scene was closely examined for fingerprints and other trace evidence. The bag was tested with cyanoacrylate, or superglue. When heated, the chemical's fumes attached to the prints, making them visible. A latent footprint was discovered that was much too large to belong to the victim. All investigators needed was a suspect to compare the footprint to.
Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate that.
Police questioned Marcia Geary's friends and family to learn where she'd been and whom she'd met recently. Her father said the last time he saw her, she'd asked him for money.
Any way I can, but...
She told him she was trying to find a job and asked him if he would help her get a car. Police also learned from her friends that she was planning to spend the weekend with a man.
Thank you. Thank you.
For now, his identity remained a mystery.
Okay.
The day after Marcia Geary was found, the body of Catherine Barrett was discovered in a San Francisco cul-de-sac. She'd been tortured and stabbed to death. Her body was wrapped in plastic. Metal shavings were retrieved from the wrapping. As police investigated this latest murder, they got a tip from a man named Raleigh Hill, the owner of Marcia Geary's apartment. Hill told police that Geary was planning to see a man named Jack for the weekend. Hill didn't know Jack's last name, but he knew he lived in a warehouse.
What'd she tell you about Jack?
Just that she was going to see him.
Hill said that on 2 occasions he'd dropped Geary off there for dates. Hill gave police the address. It was 20 miles from where Geary's body was
Show us where
found.
Jack lives then.
Yeah, I could do that.
Get there and where it is. All right, take your team members.
The warehouse served as the offices of Anthony Electric, an electrical contracting business owned by a former police officer named Anthony John Sully,
We've explained that to you already. So here's how you
better known as Jack.
Okay, do you have any other questions about it? No. Okay.
Investigators also learned that friends of Catherine Barrett, the most recent victim, told them the day before her body was found that she was going to Anthony Electric. The news sparked their interest. The information gave them enough for a search warrant for the warehouse. They were about to learn the shocking truth about Jack Sully. A homicide investigation led to an electrical contractor's warehouse, where 2 murdered prostitutes were last reported to have been going.
Fort George William Sam 451.
A costumed woman wearing a tutu met police at the door. She led them to a small apartment in the rear of the warehouse. Among the litter of drug paraphernalia, police confronted a disoriented, partially clad Jack Sully. As they explored the room, the bizarre scene became grotesque.
Well, walking into this apartment, one gets the sense that it's almost like a torture chamber. He had a hook up on the ceiling. He had various ropes around. He had VCR tapes of pornography and sadism. And one would just get the feeling that it was a horrible place.
In a preliminary search of the apartment and surrounding warehouse, police found several important pieces of evidence, including a pistol with the barrel removed. It contained nylon-covered bullets, just like the one that killed Marcia Geary.
Sheriff, you need to place this man under arrest.
A gun without a barrel might explain the odd oblong shape of the victim's wound, since a bullet shot from it would tend to be unstable and tumble instead of going straight. Jack Sully was arrested and charged with the murder of Marcia Geary.
Sheriff, go ahead and bring him this way.
The warehouse was now a crime scene and subject to a full-blown forensics investigation.
We photographed virtually every inch of it. We covered every inch of it. And we're happy that we did because we gained a lot of evidence out of it.
Finding anything in here at all? Got a couple same.
Among their finds were metal shavings and nylon rope, like those found at the crime scenes. Investigators also found blood, lots of it. The warehouse seemed to be a grim chamber of horrors, an inner sanctum for unspeakable acts of torture and cruelty. With Jack Sully behind bars, police began to ask his acquaintances what they knew about him. They learned he'd bragged about killing 3 people, putting them in barrels, and dumping them in Golden Gate Park. Now that a suspect was finally in custody, investigators could compare his prints against the ones taken from the barrels of the unsolved triple murder. As soon as he received samples of Sully's prints, Kenneth Moses knew the results.
I took a look at the prints, and believe me, I knew those prints by heart. The minute I saw Sully's prints, I knew this was the guy.
Sully was charged with the murders of the victims found in Golden Gate Park. Police also obtained his footprints. They compared them to the print lifted from the garbage bag found where Marcia Geary's body had been dragged. The prints matched. In the end, an insurmountable stack of forensics evidence was brought against Jack Sully. Metal shavings found in his warehouse matched shavings found on his second victim's body. The plastic sheeting found around the body of the man sealed in one of the 55-gallon barrels matched sheeting found in Jack Sully's truck. From the investigation, Sully's pattern of violence became clear. Under the influence of freebased cocaine, he would pick up prostitutes. When they arrived at his warehouse, he would subject them to prolonged periods of bondage, beatings, and sexual abuse, and ultimately, he murdered them. Forensics linked him to 5 victims, but other evidence proved he had killed 6. On June 3, 1986, Anthony John Sully was convicted of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death in California. Serial killers follow no apparent rules except one: to blend in with everyone else. On June 28, 1989, in Riverside, California, 2 construction workers stopped on the side of the road to eat their lunch. But then they noticed the body of a woman lying at the bottom of an embankment. Officers and forensic technicians from Riverside County Sheriff's Office responded to their call. The victim was dressed in shorts and a man's Western-style shirt. A towel covered her body. She had no identification. The autopsy revealed the woman was strangled to death. A search of the fingerprints file identified her as Tara Biggs, a 28-year-old prostitute. Evidence collected from the crime scene was sent to the California Department of Justice Crime Lab. Investigators found little more than a few assorted fibers. Whoever killed this woman didn't leave much evidence behind. On December 13, 1989, in Riverside, California, another female victim, Pamela Martin, was discovered on a rural road. She appeared to have been killed elsewhere, redressed, and abandoned there. Like the woman found 6 months earlier, she too was a prostitute. There were other similarities. Police found fibers similar to those found on the first victim. They also found tire tracks. Photographs were taken for examination in the lab. The photographs were blown up to actual size. The tread pattern and wear marks would be unique to the killer's vehicle. Criminalists identified 2 different brands of tires. They determined the killer probably drove a truck or a van with an alignment problem, causing the front tires to wear more quickly than the rear. The similarities between the crime scenes linked the 2 murders to a single killer, and he wasn't finished yet. In the 16 months following the discovery of the first victim, 6 more prostitutes were found murdered in and around Riverside. The information on the tires proved invaluable, according to Steve Sikowski of the California Department of Justice Crime Lab.
As subsequent victims were found, we were armed with the information of what kind of tire track we would be looking for, and that would be one of the first things we could see whether or not, in fact, this is another one of the series that was developing.
When area police departments met to compare forensic evidence, they realized that along with the tire tracks, the hair and fiber evidence was consistent. Gray and red fibers, gold threads and bits of rope were found on most of the bodies. These fibers lifted from the victims literally tied the murders together.
We were able to determine that, in fact, it looked like we had the same suspect environment from one victim to the next. And really what that meant to the investigation was it looked like we did, in fact, have a serial killer.
With each new murder, the killer grew bolder and more sadistic. Police found the body of another prostitute, Laura Mills, in a grove of trees, stabbed and strangled. A peeled and partially eaten grapefruit lay nearby. This odd detail gave police an idea of the kind of monster they were dealing with, according to senior investigator Bob Creed.
To where he could just have murdered this person, strangled this person, stabbed this person, and then stood over her and ate a grapefruit. We felt that this told us something about the emotional makeup of this person that we were looking for.
Police seemed no closer to finding him. By 1991, 10 prostitutes had been murdered, and several had been redressed and left in rural areas. The only clues to the killer's identity were the fibers, hairs, and tire tracks that he left behind. But without suspects, this evidence amounted to nothing. Since the victims were prostitutes and drug users, police questioned women working the red light districts of Riverside and Elsinore. Men known to frequent these areas were investigated as potential suspects. One woman provided a description of a man who had roughed her up. A sketch was made from her description. It was distributed, but no lead surfaced. Investigators hoped to have better luck focusing on the killer's vehicle. The tires left their unique prints on each murder scene, and the interior may have provided the fibers found on the victims. If investigators could find his vehicle, they could find the killer.
So we let the investigators know to look for a vehicle with certain type tires on it. Let them know that they might be looking for a vehicle that had gray interior carpet. They might find some rope fibers. They might also find some other things in the van that had gold fibers in it, because we found a prevalence of gold type fibers. Maybe some blanket, sleeping bag along that line, because of the type fibers that we found on many of the victims.
At an earlier murder scene, police found the tread prints of a popular tennis shoe near the victim. As the spree of murders continued, forensic technicians began to see the same prints. As the tennis shoe's print continued turning up, the tread showed increasing wear. Likewise, the tire tracks found at the scenes were changing, as individual tires wore unevenly and had to be replaced. In January 1991, detectives from several area agencies met to create a task force. In July, with no end in sight, a behavioral scientist was brought in to study the crimes and create a profile of the killer. Since serial killers rarely kill outside of their race, the profile described a white male between the ages of 35 and 40. The police profile and other news of the serial killings filled the newspapers. It appeared that the suspect himself was following the report, as the next victim was Tracy O'Donnell, who'd been stabbed, strangled, posed, and mutilated. Though she shared these similarities with most of the other victims, one thing made her unique. She was African American.
That he read in the paper that the serial killer stays within their own race, and yet he went out and found this black prostitute and killed her. It seemed like he did that just to show us that we were wrong, and that perhaps maybe he selects his victims, that he's in control here.
The murderer was maintaining his anonymity, and he was becoming more defiant. By the end of 1991, his victims were being found at the terrifying rate of 1 per month. 19 dead female prostitutes had been discovered, and there would undoubtedly be more. Investigators in Riverside, California, on the trail of a brutal serial killer, finally got a break on January 9th, 1992. An officer patrolling the red light district of Elsinore saw a man speaking to a prostitute from his van. The man drove off, making a right turn without signaling. The officer pulled the van over. The driver's name was William Suff. The officer thought his van fit the description of the vehicle of the suspected serial killer. He noticed the tires were mismatched, and each showed a different wear pattern. William Suff was placed under arrest. His van was impounded at the police station and given a thorough inspection. Police found a gold pillow and a sleeping bag. A blood-stained knife was wedged ominously between the driver's seat and the console. Investigators also found a length of rope, consistent with rope fibers found on the victims. While the knife and other evidence from the van went to the lab, investigators obtained a warrant to search Suff's home. There, they found a worn pair of sneakers that matched prints found near several of the earlier victims. Officers also found Western-style shirts, like the one that had been found on the first victim, and a stack of vehicle maintenance receipts. Back at the lab, DNA tests were performed on the knife found in Suff's van. The results matched the blood of the last victim. William Suff's blood, saliva, and other bodily fluids were tested to establish his DNA profile for comparison to fluid evidence found on some of the victims. In many cases, it was a match. Fiber from the gold pillow and sleeping bag, along with samples of Suff's hair, also matched evidence found at the crime scenes. Tire marks from Suff's van were consistent with imprints photographed at several locations. The vehicle maintenance records were also helpful in establishing when Suff had his tires rotated or changed. Police kept their own records of the tire positions at each crime scene. When they compared Suff's records with their own notes, they found an exact match. Police were able to surmise William Suff's homicidal pattern. He would cruise the red light districts.
Hi. I'm fine. How are you? Doing good. Good. You looking for a date?
When he chose a prostitute, he would invite her into his van and drive to a secluded place. He subdued his victims, tying them so he could torture and rape. Then he killed them, either by stabbing or strangulation. Occasionally, he dressed the victims in articles of his own clothing so he could move them without getting blood in his van. He made no effort to hide the remains. On July 19, 1995, William Suff was convicted of multiple murders. He was sentenced to death 12 times. A serial killer's compulsion for murder never stops. Once he finds a pattern that works, he'll stick with it time and again. But the pattern that provides his success also establishes a trail for those who are sworn to track him down.